So what is an aperture in photography? Lots of confusion here, but don't worry, we are going to break it down in this tutorial. I'm going to teach you what an aperture is. We're going to look at f-stops and the aperture sequence and what all them numbers mean. We are going to look at how you can control what's called depth of field using apertures. That's that blurriness in the background. And I'm going to give you a task so that you can have a go at this yourself and take real control over apertures and depth of field in your photography. Plus you can download all of what I'm telling you in this video for free. There's a link in the description. You can download it, print it out, keep it on your phone, whatever, for when you're out shooting. Okay, let's look at what an aperture is in photography. So this is an aperture. Right here I'm going to use an old Nikon lens to show you this, and it's basically a hole within the lens that gets bigger and smaller, and that hole lets in more or less light. And it's just like the pupil in your eye. When it's bright, your pupil shuts down and gets really small, letting in less light, and when it's really dark, the pupil opens up to let in more light. And in its simplest term, that is what an aperture in photography is. It's a hole inside the lens that gets bigger or smaller to let in more or less light. Now let's talk about why the F. All right, now you would have seen on the back of your camera a load of numbers, and one of them numbers will have the letter F in front of it. And the F stands for focal ratio, and it is some mathematical calculation that you don't need to worry about, and I think it's something like F equals the focal length over the diameter of the hole, or something along them lines, right? Don't quote me on it, but that's what the F stands for. It stands for focal ratio. And now let's talk about a typical aperture sequence in cameras. Now overlaying on your screen now is a typical aperture sequence, and it's going from f2, f2.8, f4, f5.6 and so on. Now that is a typical aperture sequence. Now firstly, on some cameras you may not have f2.8 or f2, the lower numbers, and the reason for that is it's more expensive for wide apertures in lenses. So if you've got a very expensive lens, it will generally go to f2.8. If you don't, if you have general kit lenses, it will probably be around f4, f5.6. Now let's just make this clear at this point in time. Don't go out and spending a fortune on lenses until you've learned photography properly, all right? It's not going to make much of a difference at this stage, at your learning stage, so just stick to what you've got. But just remember that you may not have them lower numbers, the wider apertures, with a cheaper kit lens. And now let's talk about them numbers in relationship to the hole. Very confusing here, and this is a major confusing point for learning photographers. The lower the number, the wider the hole, or the bigger the hole. The smaller the hole, the bigger the number, and it is very confusing, but really just think in opposites, right? That's all you need to think of, is opposites when it comes to apertures. If it's a high number, it's a small hole. And then quite clearly with them holes, the bigger hole lets in more light and the smaller hole lets in less light. So an aperture of f4 or f2.8 is going to let in a lot more light into your camera than an aperture of f16 or f22. So now let's talk about f-stops. That's something that you hear a lot. You know, what is an f-stop? Well, first of all, we need to talk about what a stop is, because you don't just have stops in apertures, you also have stops in shutter speeds as well, because a stop is to do with light. And if you increase the light by one stop, you are actually doubling the amount of light. And if you are decreasing the light by one stop, you are halving the amount of light. So when it actually comes to talking about f-stops, it's not really to do with numbers as specific, it's just to do with the stops of light. So if you went from f4 to f5.6, what you've done is you have decreased the light by half, and that means that you've gone down by one stop. So you've gone from one f-stop to the next. Now, stops in photography is a whole nother lesson. It's a whole nother confusing thing that you need to learn, but don't worry, I'm going to put a link in the description of this video, and there is also a link going to come across the video as well, and that will take you to a page where it's going to explain stops in photography in much more depth. Now let's talk about apertures and depth of field. So depth of field, to put it in an absolute nutshell, is that blurriness in the background, and that's the shots that you all want to take, don't you? Nice portrait with a blurry background. Well, that's called depth of field, and the aperture is just one element that controls depth of field, and it basically works like this. The bigger the hole, the lower the F number, the shallower the depth of field that you will get. In a nutshell, the blurrier the background will be, okay? The smaller the hole, the larger the F number, the sharper the background will be, and that's generally referred to as a longer depth of field. And for a really quick example of using depth of field, portraits are normally taken with a wider aperture, which is going to give you a shallow depth of field, a blurry background, whereas landscapes are normally taken with a smaller aperture, which is going to give you a long depth of field, which means the picture is going to be sharp from the foreground right the way to the background. Now, it's all right talking about this, but actually you will only learn it when you put it into practice. So that's exactly what we're going to do now. I'm going to do a really simple task to demonstrate using apertures, UF numbers, and controlling depth of field. And before I show you this task and put it into practice, I just want to take this opportunity to tell you about the courses that we run over at theschoolofphotography.com. If you want to learn photography properly, and I mean properly, in a structured way by professional teachers, come over and see us at theschoolofphotography.com. We will take all the confusion out of learning photography and put it into a lovely structured form, and I can absolutely promise you that by the time you finish that photography course, you will be in much more control over your camera and the visual effects of photography. So come and join us and tens of thousands of students all over the world and take our photography courses. Right, let's talk to you about the task that I'm going to show you and that you are hopefully going to do yourself. Firstly, what you need is a tripod, so make sure you put your camera on a tripod, and you want a fence or a brick wall or some kind of repeated pattern, and that's so that you can see the visual effect easy. Yeah, it's not going to be exciting, but it's going to help you learn. The next thing to do is to get yourself at quite an acute angle up against your fence or wall or whatever you're going to do, and get a focus point that is, I don't know, like a metre in front of your lens, or maybe 1.5 meters or something like that, okay? And then you make sure that that focus point is the same in every single picture that you're going to take throughout this task. The next thing I want you to do is put your camera onto aperture priority. That is AV on a Canon or A on a Nikon and other cameras. Then put your ISO onto auto and make sure that you're outside, obviously, and it's like daytime, so you've got plenty of light. And the next thing that you need to do is zoom your camera lens into around 50mm of focal length. It doesn't have to be accurate. Anywhere between 35 and 50mm of focal length will do the job. And if you don't know what focal lengths are, it's quite simply the number on the top of your lens that matches up with a line or a dot, and as you zoom in and out, you match that line up with the number, and in this case it's 50. And then put your camera onto its 2-second or 10-second timer, whatever you've got on your camera, and that will enable the camera to stay still during each of the pictures. And then what you're going to do is you're going to take pictures using each of the F numbers that I've given you on that aperture sequence. Now, this bit's important. You will get numbers in between them F numbers, okay? So for instance, between F5.6 and F8, you will have, on some cameras, you might have F6.3 and F7.1 and whatever. It just depends on the camera that you've got. They are third of stops, and we're going to ignore third of stops. It confuses you as you're learning. You want to stick to the whole stops. And like I said, if you want to learn about stops properly, there's a link in the description of this video. Just click on that and it will teach you, all right? But for now, you're going to stick to the aperture sequence numbers that I gave you earlier on in this video. So now let's take some shots so you can visually see the effects that apertures have on a picture. So I'm all set up just like I've told you before, and my first aperture that I'm going to start on is f4. So I've got my focus point, 2-second timer, take the shot. Easy as that. Now I'm going to change my aperture to f5.6, take the next shot. Then I'm going to change my aperture to f8, take the shot. F11, take the shot. F16, take the shot. F22, take the shot. So what you would have seen in them pictures is the depth of field changing each time we went up an f-stop. So with a wider aperture like f4, we've got a much shallower depth of field, a much blurrier background, whereas with the f22 shot, we've got a much longer depth of field, meaning the picture is a lot more sharper in the foreground and the background of the shot. And when you put them two pictures together, you can really see a dramatic difference between the visual effect of those pictures. And that effectively is what an aperture is doing. It's not only controlling the amount of light that comes in and out of your camera, it is one element that is controlling the depth of field of your picture, or the blurriness of the foreground and background. Now it's important to know as well that the aperture is only one element of photography that controls depth of field. There are other elements that control depth of field, and if you do want to learn all of the elements and take real control, please come and check out our complete guide to photography course over at the School of Photography. If this video has helped you out, you need to help us out. Please, please, please press the like button, share it with your friends. Tell us what you think in the comments. Have you been confused about apertures in the past, and how have you overcome it? Tell us in the comments. Also, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell button if you want more videos like this. If you don't subscribe, then you won't hear from us ever again, right? So if you do like our videos, don't forget to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and remember, if you want to learn photography properly, come over and see us at theschoolofphotography.com.